Welcome back to our channel. We're going to keep on with Morse Coffin's account of his experience at the Battle of Sand Creek. And last time we had left off, he was giving a detailed account about how when the soldiers arrived, they saw a deserted village and how they made their way up along the creek and were pursuing fleeing Indians. He even just gave an account before we shortly left off part one about seeing an Indian actually shoot a soldier dead. And so you need to go ahead and watch part one as well. The link to part one will be in the comments of this video. So again, thank you for watching. If you go ahead and just hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell if you like these videos, and leave a comment about what you think about Morse Coffin's account. And so we're just going to get right back into learning from Morse Coffin, who was, an eyewitness, who was a soldier at Sand Creek. So we're going to just pick up with his account here. After a little more firing, my gun, a Smith & Wesson carbine, became so foul that an empty shell stuck fast in it, which all my efforts failed to remove, and I also spoiled the little concern used for that purpose. I hadn't yet learned that by wetting the shells in the mouth immediately before firing, they could be easily removed with the thumb and finger. I then used my revolver, but after several shots, that was also rendered useless by a piece of gun cap getting down next to the lock, so it could not be cocked, nor could I remove the obstruction. While working away, trying to get one of my shooting irons in working condition, some time having elapsed since a shot had been fired, my Indian raised up in full view and moved about in his little fort. I thought him bold, as he could not know my arms were out of fix. Instantly recollecting the soldiers, whom I had not seen or even thought of since discovered by us, I turned to see where they were, when off to my right, as I faced my old enemy, and distant about 100 yards, sat an Indian on his pony, calmly looking at me, while a little beyond was another riding down towards the other full tilt. Then I knew it was Indians, not soldiers, we saw up the creek. How many more of them were in sight I tarried not to see, but thinking that not a good place for me, with both gun and revolver out of fix, I quickly mounted my horse. He stood like a statue all these hours, and ran him in a sort of zigzag course through the deep sand of the creek, bending forward on the saddle as I went. Two or three shots came rather close before getting out of range, but I took no time to turn to see where they came from or to learn if I was followed. After going 200 or 300 yards down the creek bed, I turned up the west bank, where I was agreeably surprised to find a comrade, P.M. Williams, a brave boy, and as cool and self-possessed in the presence of danger as anyone I ever saw, either at Sand Creek or elsewhere. This is how a young Williams came to be here, in a dangerous place, afoot, and alone as I found him. During the progress of our company up the creek, he had, for some reason unknown to me, tied his horse to a bush near the east bank of the creek, and a little below where I found him, and having reached the west bank, had been holding the head of a wounded man of some company of the third, and caring for him about 3 hours, and until the arrival of the ambulance. In the meantime, I think the man died, but of this I am not certain, as I am ignorant of several items which deserve mention just here, and which I am disappointed at not yet having obtained from the one, now in the East, capable of imparting the desired information. One or two other wounded or dead soldiers were also taken from this part of the field, one of them the one shot near the clump of the bushes, but whether this man was dead or among the wounded, I cannot say. On the departure of the ambulance, Williams remained in the hope of being able to get his horse, which he repeatedly attempted, but whenever he started to cross in that direction, the fire of a lot of the enemies and rifle pits a little below would be turned on him and oblige him to turn back, and as matters became worse and worse, instead of better, the idea of securing his horse was abandoned until he should succeed in saving himself. At this time all the troops had left this part of the field. In fact, the work of the day was presumed to be about over. Indians now boldly showed themselves in several directions, not only up the creek from where I just came, but also along the brow of the bluff to the north and northwest of us, and within easy rifle range. Williams was armed with a large dragoon revolver only, as he had lent his gun to a comrade who had lost his own during the headlong ride of the morning. For a time, the chances seemed to be rather against our escaping from this place. It was unsafe to remain where we were, and we scarcely dared to move in any direction, as directly between us and the camp we knew were a lot of the enemy in rifle pits, and how many were scattered around no one could tell. About the time when our surrounding looked the worst, we saw a company of soldiers which, from their carrying the regimental flag, we knew to be I of the Third, a mile or more to the south, and on our side of the creek opposite the village. They seemed to halt and hesitate a little, but soon they moved up toward us. This gladdened us, and we went slowly forward. The company bore away a little to the right and attacked the Indians in the rifle pits, under the high bank just below and to the east of us. This was the same crowd who fired on Williams. Here a lively firing was kept up for some time, and when the company drew off, one of their number was tied across his horse, dead. Williams and myself were glad to fall in with them, as they returned to camp via the same route they came, avoiding the immediate bank of the creek. As afterwards proved, there were more Indians in pits between those attacked by Company I and camp. I think it was about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, likely the latter hour, when Company I came in, and I know nothing of any fighting after this, though to the positive knowledge of myself and others, there was no special lack of Indians up the creek, and some within sight of our camp. Some time after this, Lieutenant Dixon and others saw about 15 or 20 Indians withdraw from the rifle pits about three-fourths of a mile to a mile above camp, and move off, and the lieutenant called the attention of Colonel Shoup to it, but the colonel either made no reply or did not think it best to attack them. The fact was that both men and horses were very tired and hungry, and the boys were glad for an opportunity to rest and look around camp, where much of interest was to be seen. But before detailing the latter, I will give some particulars connected with the one man wounded and two killed of Company D. Henry C. Foster was killed at the east bank of the creek early in the day, and just after myself and others left the company to go on the plain. I believe he was shot in the neck and also in the region of the heart, and probably died almost instantly. He was a good man and good soldier, and one who never shirked duty. He had been on the sick list for some time, and reported himself for duty 2 days before the fight, though known to be still weak and not in a suitable condition to perform such service as this jaunt required. Later in the day, while the company were fighting far up the creek, Corporal Maxwell exchanged shots with an Indian who was hidden, or partly so, and when Maxwell partially turned to reload his gun, the Indian shot him through the chest, the ball passing through one lung and just missing the heart. As soon as the Indian made this shot, he started to run, but Jack's gun was reloaded by this time, and turning, he shot and killed the Indian as he went. This was witnessed by Sergeant Barney and others. Jack then spoke to someone nearby and said he had killed the fellow, and added, "But he has got me too." And when answered, "Oh no, I guess not," replied, "Yes, he has. I am shot right through." After going a few steps, he sank and laid down on the sand, the boys attending closely to his wants until the ambulance arrived, which was at once sent for. Maxwell was a large and powerful man, and consequently a capital mark for an Indian's gun. He was also a splendid shot. His iron constitution enabled him to pull through with life, but with the reasonable certainty of his having cause to remember Sand Creek until the day of his death. But what was by common consent considered to be the tragedy of the day, in which Company D were concerned, took place on the open plain to the east of the creek, and at least 4 miles from the village, and resulted in the death of Robert McFarland, a man well and favorably known by the old settlers of Boulder and vicinity, and who was much missed by his comrades. Corporal Steve Phillips, McFarland, Lockhart, Ripley, Elliott, and Montgomery were in the same section of country, and some of them were driving in a small herd of ponies, as I intimated in a former letter, but they were scattered considerably, and sometimes may be but two or three with the stock. While proceeding thus, Phillips and McF, being near each other, discovered a buffalo robe lying in the grass, and as they approached it, one of them expressed his belief that it covered an Indian. When within perhaps 20 or 30 feet of it, McFarland turned his horse and dismounted on the side next to it. Instantly an Indian raised from under it with a yell and bounding and jumping about so lively that, though both fired their carbines at him, neither hit him. While he let fly the arrows from an immense bow, Mac dodged behind his horse, and the latter was quickly disabled by receiving a number of arrows. Mac soon received an arrow in his side when he rushed at the Indian, who I think had approached very near in the meantime, and dealt him a blow with his gun, a Smith and Wesson, which broke the stock in splinters, but did no apparent harm to the Indian. Then they seem to have clinched, and Lockhart thinks the Indian jammed an arrow in Mac's heart with his hand, which may or may not be a fact, as it not known to a certainty. Lockhart thinks the arrow in the side was not what killed him. Anyway, it appears that Mac no sooner closed with the warrior than he fell back and made some exclamation like, "Boys, I'm killed," or "Oh God, boys, I'm killed," or similar to this, and died. This had of course occupied but a minute or two of time. Now came Philip's turn, and he promptly closed with the big warrior, who was a powerful fellow, while Steve was of moderate height, but a broad, stout, vigorous, and resolute young man, and the rider hereof knows he was a good at a rough and tumble. Phillips got one of the Indian's arms or hands in limbo, and kept it thus, but the Indian being so much larger or taller, bent down over him, and with his free hand full of arrows, was doing his best to kill him, by jabbing the arrows in his head and neck. But Steve was tough, and seems to have protected himself somewhat. In the meantime, Judge Ripley and William Elliott hurried up and killed the Indian by shooting him in the head and the other in the body at about the same time. All this seems to have transpired very quickly, and was witnessed by Lockhart, who was on his Indian mule about 75 yards away, trying in vain to get the contrary animal forward, in order to render assistance, but it would not leave the herd. Although these combatants were very near at the start, and little time given in which to plan or even think, still it is unaccountable that while Mac and Steve both had revolvers, neither seemed to have drawn them, or attempted to do so. During the whole of this encounter, the Indian kept up a yelling or song of sort, probably his death song or chant, as this would seem to be a very proper occasion for it. Philip's hat and coat collar showed hard usage, and were chopped to rags with the arrows. Steve, on being liberated, showed considerable excitement, and hurried the boys away so quickly that none of them thought to remove from McFarland's body his revolver or other valuables. The revolver he carried belonged to Sergeant Dwight, who was with the transportation, and he also had on a valuable field glass belonging to Lieutenant Pinnock. These things, as well as anything else he had, fell into the hands of the enemy. Thus the mistake of myself and others in not visiting his body when first informed of his death became apparent. Near the close of the day, a strong squad in charge of Sergeant Barney brought in his body. They found it stripped of everything except drawers, his chest chopped open, and his broken gun jammed in the wound. He was not scalped, as his hair was cut short. Beside it is, I think, the custom among Indians to take no scalp from those killed by others. But in regard to this, the Sand Creek soldiery were not over particular. While this squad were out, they were closely watched by Indians on the return to camp. Quite a large party kept for some time just out of range of their guns, while now and then one would circle toward the boys, evidently with the intent to toll some of them away in order to cut them off. But the boys were not to be caught just then, but held themselves in readiness in case they came close. This Indian who killed McFarland was an uncommon large and powerful one, and several who saw him as he lay dead believed him to be Left Hand, a prominent Arapaho chief, and who used to be seen by the old settlers of Boulder and St. Vrain during 1860 and 1861. But from information since gained, I guess it was not he, as I have since learned from a source apparently reliable that during the fight Left Hand had a leg broken between ankle and knee, and after stumping it for 3 days ingloriously died. This may be incorrect, but thus I heard it. Late in the afternoon, if I am correctly informed, the captain of Company I, his name I think was Buchanan, sent to Colonel Shivington requesting that the artillery be sent to shell the enemy from the pits up the creek, but whether this request was made just before his company made the last assault on the rifle pits, as mentioned in my last letter, or on his return from the charge, knowing more were up there, I cannot say. But the request was not complied with, which was no doubt on account of a scarcity of ammunition for the guns, as it had run low, and earlier in the day an order had been sent back to Lieutenant Pennock, in charge of transportation, to forward a supply without delay. It was after this that a lot of the enemy were seen to leave the pits, as before mentioned. My object in being thus particular is to show that after the fighting of the day was over, and the troops in camp, that were more than of the enemy not far away, and that the colonels knew the fact. The killing of Jack Smith, a half Indian son of John Smith, the U.S. interpreter, who was in the village for trading purposes when the battle opened, has given rise to some crooked statements. It seems young Smith was held in and about his father's lodge as a sort of prisoner, and during the afternoon, after most of the fighting was over, many of the boys gathered about the place and quizzed and questioned Smith considerably about these Indians, the battle, etc. They knew he was lying, but they gave him rope and let him yarn it the more. Among the others in the fight, saw him shoot, and even saw him shoot at some of their own number there present. Consequently, the feeling was strong against him. After a while, a soldier with a carbine in his hands, which was cocked and pointed toward Smith, stood talking with the latter just outside the lodge door, spinning a yard, as the boys knew, when the gun went off, the ball passing through Smith's chest and killing him immediately. The soldier pretended it was accidental. The body was pulled into the lodge, where was also a squaw, John Smith's squaw, I believe, though not presumed to be the mother of young S. Someone of the boys favored scalping him as though he were a complete Indian, but this was not done. The shooting caused some stir, and an inclination on the part of some to use the lodge and other things thereabouts pretty rough, but Colonel Shoup got on a wagon nearby and talked to the boys, threatening punishment on any one molesting anything in the lodge, and sending the crowd away. The colonel mentioned the killing as though accidental. Plenty of our company knew the main facts of this affair, but I give this as given recently by H. J. Lockhart, a man of veracity and well known in the vicinity of Longmont, and who stood within a few feet of the two when it took place, having stepped up near to hear the talk. I have never, as I remember, heard an opinion other than that the killing was intentional, and also that he deserved what he got. I have no doubt the officers understood it, though as I recall it from memory, Colonel Shoup in his official report of the battle mentioned young S. being taken violently ill and died before morning. John Smith spoke approvingly of his son's death, but whether or not from motives of policy I cannot say. He, Jack, was said to be a bad one. John Brown of Company D gobbled young Smith's gun. During the day, two of the boys of Company D were driving in a small herd of ponies, and following with them was a squaw carrying a child. They encountered Colonel Shoup, who told them, "Take no prisoners," or "We take no prisoner," or words similar. The squaw seemed to understand the import of the words, and without saying a word, turned her back to the boys, who shot them both, as they considered the colonel's words equal to an order to kill them. I heard of this about the time of its occurrence, but lately heard it again from the lips of one of the parties, a well-known and prominent citizen of Longmont, and who then as now considered it a tough transaction. I give this because it is one of the incidents of the battle, and for the further reason that neither Colonel Shivington or Colonel Shoup, not to mention others, have been honest in this matter, but have pretended that the killing of women and children in this battle was entirely unavoidable, could not be helped, as all were in the rifle pits together, etc., etc. And if I mistake not, some time after the battle, Colonel Shoup wrote a letter which appeared in a Colorado paper, claiming the above to be the case. Now I know a part of this is true, and that many were unavoidably killed, that it was not easy to distinguish the sexes during the fight, and that it would have been impossible to help killing many women and children. And I also know perfectly well, and nearly every other man who was in the Sand Creek fight must be satisfied of it, that it was the purpose during that battle to kill old and young of both sexes. That is the fact of the case, and it is useless to shirk it, or to pretend it was all accidental. Soon after the fight opened, as old Mr. Otterby, I think it was he, and Pixley, who had secured quite a herd of Indian stock and taken it to the main herd, which was being held or herded by the Mexican company a mile or so south of the village, and three others were nearing the village, they saw that the sand had recently been disturbed, and one suggested that the Indians were in there, and on poking around, one jumped up and was shot by the old man, and soon two others were found and killed. They had been completely covered with sand. It is more than likely many escaped by burying themselves in this way, and cases were related where Indians or squaws would be seen to drop down, and after making the sand fly lively for a minute or two, to be out of sight. Since writing the above account of the killing of Jack Smith, I have received from a friend and ex-Sand Creeker a version which differs slightly from that given above, and which illustrates the difficulty of learning particulars correctly even from eyewitnesses. Both these men stood very near at the time, and both have good memories of events, nor would I hesitate to vouch for the honest intent of either in a matter of this sort. This man says Smith was shot by a soldier of the Colorado First, and that the man who shot him was sitting down in the midst of a crowd of soldiers who had collected per agreement, and a space was left by the boys in standing for the pistol ball to pass through. During the night's march to Sand Creek, the horse of Jim DuBois of Company D gave out, and he was left afoot and alone miles in the rear, not by any means a desirable situation. He was attached to Captain Johnson's company of the Provost Guard, and after his horse had lagged along for miles, he sent word by a passing soldier to Captain J, and requesting that a fresh horse be sent him, as he knew there were several extra ones for that purpose. It seems this message never reached the captain. When Jim had led his horse until he would move no further, he stripped him and turned him loose. Then, taking all his ammunition and a little grub, he took the trail and exerted himself to the utmost to overtake the command. In this he entirely failed. At daybreak he was still on the open plain with no one else in sight. Soon after sunrise he heard the boom of the artillery and firing of guns, and knew the battle had opened. The feelings of one similarly situated can be imagined, but not easily described. He was probably from 4 to 6 miles out when he first heard the guns. Soon after this, and when within 2 or 3 miles of the battleground, he saw a large party of Indians a mile or so to the west, and as they approached he was enabled to count them 2 or 3 times, and made out 75 in number, there being 9 horses carrying 2 Indians each. This is an abridged and very tame account of DuBois' experiences during the morning, the most interesting particulars of which the writer is not allowed to give on account of the extreme modesty of the one directly concerned, and who, were the full account given, might be charged with sounding his own trumpet, as there were no other witnesses except a lot of red devils on horseback. Jim was interested in learning something about these Indians, and from information gained was satisfied they left the village just as the command came in view around the point where we halted to strip for action, and he was told that in many cases there were 3 Indians on one horse, though he saw but 2 on any one animal. So far as I am informed, this was the largest party of the enemy who escaped in a body either immediately before, during, or after the flight. Du Bois, who knew about it, says the request for artillery assistance mentioned above in this letter was made by Company I after the general engagement was over, and was for the purpose of shelling some 50 Indians out of the trench about a mile up the creek. These were the same who afterward escaped. Readers of this account need not be told that no pretense is made of detailing movements of the main command or particulars, save in a case or two relating to the killed and wounded or other companies other than our own, and for the simple reason that I know next to nothing of these things. I take it that an Indian battle is not like other battles. In this battle, companies were separated from others of the battalion, squads were detached from their companies, and in other cases, individuals were pursuing their own way and fighting the enemy in the manner to them seemed best. I have reason to believe that a field history of the battle, with particulars of incidents witnessed, would prove vastly more interesting to the general reader than the little the writer hereof has been able to give of the fight itself, and that it would comprise sufficient to fill a fair-sized volume. The instances of personal bravery during the day were very numerous, and many examples of such were current at the time, nor were these cases confined to soldiers alone. The enemy proved themselves to be possessed of the most daring courage, especially in emergencies. I believe the Sand Creek fight raised in the minds of many their estimation of Indian courage. In my next, I will give something of the results of the battle in killed and wounded. Some particulars deserving mention in a former letter were overlooked. The horse of the Indian who killed McFarland was taken during the melee and secured by some of the boys and brought to the 2 little children of the deceased, who by this affair were left orphans. The horse was a very large one, and must have required the strength of a powerful man to spring it. Mac's horse probably died, but whatever its condition, it, with the saddle and fixtures, fell into the hands of the enemy. The Indians left the body as the boys approached when they went to get it. Jack Maxwell brought away with him as a valued trophy the scalp of the Indian who shot him, which was taken for him by one of the boys. I think it was before noon that the work of demolition of the enemy's village commenced. As many of the teepees as were required for the use of the wounded men were taken for that purpose, and the others, together with the many tons of Indian supplies which the village contained, were piled and burned. The number of lodges or teepees were, as I remember, between 130 and 135. Of all the Indian camps I had before seen, this one showed the most wealth. The supplies seemed to be bountiful. A look around, even after much was burned, was of great interest. At least it was so to me. There must have been tons of dried buffalo meat and large and numerous packages of coffee, sugar, dried cherries, etc., were on every hand. Saddles, bridles, and lariats, robes and skins in all stages of tanning process, in fact, plenty of all, which goes to complete an Indian outfit. There were numerous new axes of small pattern, and which must have been drawn very recently. The number of medicine men in camp must have been rather numerous, judging from the many well-filled medicine bags found. It seemed to be the general opinion among the boys that if Uncle Sam furnished the commissary supplies for that camp, they were rather better looked after than were by his own boys. But it is quite possible some of the many articles were furnished them by John Smith in the course of trade. It really seemed a pity to destroy all of these supplies, so much needed by other miserable creatures of the plains. But then this is war, and these are enemies. In one lodge was found an aged squaw who had suicided by hanging herself. I believe there were a number of scalps of white people found among the trumpery, also daguerreotypes, children and women's wearing apparel, etc. I am not sure that I saw these things, but have not the least doubt they were there, as it is well known. We're going to go ahead and just break there as we continue on with Morse Coffin's account of what he witnessed and heard about Sand Creek. And even it's important to look at many eyewitnesses, because even with Morse, he didn't even see a lot of the things he's even writing about. He heard about them from some things from other soldiers. So it's just important to kind of look at everything and kind of see what they have to say. And there's a reason why we look and take a good look at eyewitness accounts, because my parents, Chuck and Sheri Bowen, they found the lost Sand Creek site in the late 90s, and they decided, because of a lack of, not just a lack of artifacts at what is now the National Park Service site, there were no period artifacts found below that bluff where the Indians are alleged to have been camped and slaughtered as they came out of their teepees. Not a single period artifact was found there. So they decided to do their own search and ended up finding the real location of Black Kettle's village and running battle areas. And they were able to get the clues that they needed from studying eyewitness accounts. And so these eyewitnesses, they gave great detailed accounts about the land and what the creek looked like where the village was and where they fought. And so it gave them clues to search. And this is also where my dad grew up, so he knew this land like the back of his hand. So when he's reading clues of where to search, he knows precisely where to go. And so you can read more about that in our book. We found the Lost Sand Creek site. Please check that out. Check out our website, thelostsandcreek.com, and you can see the Buy the Book tab in the top right corner of any page on the website. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Tap the notification bell so you get alerted when we post new videos. Follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/Bowen History. Subscribe here on YouTube and look at our X page and follow us on X at the Lost Sand Creek. And those links will be in the description of this video. You can follow all of our social media. And we'll continue on in the next video and finish with Morse Coffin's account of Sand Creek and what he experienced there on November 29, 1864. So follow along and go ahead, go look at that first video too. That link, again, is in the comments of this video. So thank you for watching.